Hello everyone. Today I have to share the story of what I thought was the biggest betrayal of my life. The day I knew, the moment the laughter started, that my wedding day was about to turn into something uglier than I had prepared myself for. I stood there in my gown, watching my son, Jason, and his wife, Emily, hide their smirks behind champagne glasses, nudging each other as they stared at Henry, my new husband, like he was some charity case I had dragged in off the street. Their whole family joined in, whispering loud enough for half the hall to hear, mocking his suit, his age, his quietness. And every time their snickers rose, I felt the weight of humiliation settle harder in my chest. Yet Henry remained still, composed, almost amused, as if nothing they said could ever reach him. I tried to steady my breath, reminding myself I chose this man because he treated me with a tenderness I had not known in years. But the sting of their disrespect burned through every inch of my skin, especially when Jason stood to give his toast, pretending to sound grateful while letting his words twist with cruelty, claiming I had married down, sending a wave of vicious laughter rolling across the hall. I watched Henry then, his fingers tapping once against the table, before he lifted his gaze with a calmness too controlled, too deliberate, and in the very next second, the doors of the reception hall swung open with a force that silenced everyone. 4 men in black suits entered with a kind of synchronized precision that instantly changed the temperature of the room, their eyes scanning everything before locking onto Henry, and I felt something inside me shift as they walked straight toward him without hesitation. The laughter behind me died mid-breath as the men positioned themselves quietly but powerfully around him, and Henry rose with an ease that felt entirely different from the softness he'd shown me all day. He leaned toward me, his voice low and smooth, as he said he had hoped the evening wouldn't require this, but apparently clarity was necessary. And when he stepped forward, the entire atmosphere of the room tightened, fear replacing mockery in every widened eye. I watched my son freeze, Emily grip his arm, their confidence evaporating as Henry looked over the room with a presence I didn't recognize, an authority so natural it unsettled even me. And in that moment, as the hall held its breath, I realized I barely knew the man I had married. I thought he lived quietly, simply, privately. I never once imagined he had men who moved like shadows, or that he carried a power sharp enough to cut through an entire room's arrogance with a single glance. And as everyone stared at him in stunned silence, I felt the first sliver of truth settling in my stomach. Nothing about Henry had ever been ordinary. Not his past, not his life, and certainly not his wealth. The room felt smaller as Henry straightened his jacket, a subtle motion that somehow made every person watching him pull back as though he had expanded in size. And I stood frozen in place, trying to reconcile the gentle man who made me tea every morning with the figure who now commanded the attention of an entire hall without raising his voice. His men stood like a wall behind him, unblinking, frighteningly still. And when he finally spoke, his tone was calm enough to make the silence heavier. He said he had tolerated the mocking out of respect for me, but lines had been crossed, and respect was no longer a suggestion. His words weren't loud, yet they struck the air like a warning, making Emily's mother gasp softly and Jason's jaw tighten in a way I had never seen, as though reality was catching up to him one frightening inch at a time. I watched Henry move through the space with a deliberate slowness, assessing each face at my son's table, his eyes steady and unreadable. And for the first time, I sensed something beneath his quiet nature, not anger, not pride, but power, the kind that didn't need theatrics or threats to be understood. Jason attempted a shaky laugh, insisting it was all just a joke, but Henry's eyebrow lifted slightly, and that alone shut my son down faster than any yelled reprimand could have. I wanted to speak, to smooth the situation, to explain that my family wasn't cruel, just careless, but the words caught in my throat because I wasn't entirely sure anymore. Seeing their fear now only reminded me how eager they had been to humiliate a man they assumed was beneath them. Henry turned toward me briefly, the corners of his mouth softening in a way that didn't match the aura he carried, and whispered that he had kept his life private because he wanted me to love him without the noise of his world getting in the way. My breath hitched because the implication was clear. His world was not small, quiet, or simple. Before I could gather a response, one of the men stepped forward and handed Henry a sleek black phone, murmuring something I couldn't hear, and Henry nodded slightly, dismissing him with the ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly.
And stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor, his voice cracking as he called out, "Mom, wait," to panic raw and unfiltered, now that he realized he had pushed too far, but the sound only made the room feel heavier, as if all the unspoken truths between us were finally twisting into shape. I turned toward him slowly, and the sight of his wide, frightened eyes made something deep inside me ache, yet I couldn't soften. Not this time. Not after the cruelty he'd taken part in so easily. Emily tugged on his sleeve, her face crumpled with regret that came too late, and their families sat motionless, watching me with a cocktail of guilt and shame, but none of them could undo the sting of their laughter, nor erase the way they had relished it. Henry didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone held the room still, as though the very walls were listening to what would come next. I told Jason calmly that respect is not optional, not for strangers, not for family, and certainly not for the man who chose to build a life with me. And for the first time in years, I saw my son confronted not by my disappointment, but by the reflection of his own actions. He tried to apologize, tripping over his words, but they felt limp and desperate, not because he didn't mean them, but because he finally understood the enormity of his misjudgment. Henry placed a gentle hand at the small of my back, guiding me with a care that contrasted sharply with the power he had shown the room, and I felt myself leaning into that steadiness, even as my heart twisted with the complicated grief of realizing that love cannot excuse disrespect, not even from a child. The guests parted instinctively as we moved, creating a clean path through their remorseful silence, and the sound of our footsteps echoed with a finality that made something inside me unclench. Reaching the doors, I glanced back one last time, not for their approval, not for forgiveness, but simply to mark the moment the old version of my life ended. Jason's lips trembled around a whisper of "Mom," but I knew for the first time that stepping away didn't mean abandoning him, it meant choosing myself. And when Henry opened the door and the cool night air brushed against my skin, I felt the weight of the evening fall off me, not erased, but transformed into something sharp and clarifying, as I walked forward into a future I now understood was far more extraordinary and far more guarded than I had ever imagined.
Henry glanced back at his men and gave a subtle gesture, nothing dramatic, just a flick of his fingers, and they stepped aside, still watchful, but no longer looming, which somehow made their presence even more intimidating because it showed they moved at his slightest command. Then Henry did something that silenced the room even further. He pulled a small black envelope from his inner pocket, the kind of envelope that looked as though it didn't belong in ordinary life, and handed it to me with a gentleness completely at odds with the tension in the hall. I opened it carefully, my fingers trembling, and inside was a sleek access card with his name embossed on it in muted gold, followed by mine. He explained, with no grandstanding, that this was the primary entry card to his private estate, an estate I had never been told existed, and that he had been waiting for the right moment to share that part of his life with me. My breath caught, the edges of my vision tingling with disbelief, and for a moment the room blurred into nothing. All I could see was Henry, this man who had been so content to let the world underestimate him, offering me a piece of a life far larger than anything I'd imagined. Whispers rose around us, confusion, awe, a ripple of pure shock as the weight of that single gesture sank in, and I felt a strange mixture of humility and quiet triumph bloom in my chest. Not because of the wealth implied by the card, but because Henry had chosen to reveal this side of himself only to me, not to impress, not to boast, but to trust. And while the room stared with wide eyes and trembling unease, I realized that everything they had mocked, everything they had dismissed so easily, had been nothing more than a mask he wore out of convenience, one he no longer felt compelled to hold in place now that the truth had been forced into the open. For a long moment I simply held the card in my hand, its weight feeling unreal, like something taken from another woman's life entirely, and the room watched me as if my reaction alone might determine their fate. I could sense Jason's panic rising beside Emily's silent trembling, their earlier smugness now replaced with the unmistakable fear of having insulted a man whose world extended far beyond anything they had imagined. Henry stepped slightly closer to me, not touching, just offering the quiet reassurance of his presence, and whispered that he never flaunted his wealth because he preferred to see who people were when they believed he had nothing to offer. His tone gentle, but edged with a truth that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. I felt a strange, almost surreal calm settle over me as I realized how many people in this very room had revealed themselves tonight, their laughter exposing their smallness far more brutally than any confrontation could have. And now, as they sat stiffly, their faces pale and taut, I wondered how many of them wished they could rewind time, swallow their jokes, erase their whispers, and approach Henry with even a fraction of the respect he had so quietly earned. Henry's eyes swept the room once more, not cruelly, just with a certain finality, as though he had taken everything he needed to know from the events of the evening, and when he spoke again, he did so with a soft firmness of someone making a boundary rather than issuing a threat. He said that anyone welcomed into our lives moving forward would be welcomed because they showed kindness, not status, and that entitlement had no place near us. The word "us" settled warmly inside me, grounding me amid the storm of guilt and fear radiating from the other guests,
But before I could fully absorb it, one of Henry's men stepped forward and murmured something in his ear. Henry listened, nodded once, then dismissed him with that effortless authority that made the room tense all over again. He turned back to me and told me that transportation had been arranged for us whenever I was ready, that our evening did not have to end here among people who had already shown who they were, and suddenly the hall that had once felt celebratory now seemed suffocating, stale with a residue of mockery that clung to the air. I looked around at the faces that had laughed just an hour before, faces now tight with regret, and felt an unexpected shift inside me, a quiet strength rising where only hurt had been sitting earlier. For the first time, I did not feel the urge to defend Jason, to smooth over the discomfort, to soften the blow. Instead, I felt the clear and steady understanding that respect was not owed to those who refused to offer it in return. And as Henry extended his hand to me, not commanding, merely inviting, I realized that stepping toward him meant stepping into a life far larger, far deeper, and far more unapologetically mine than anything I had allowed myself to imagine before tonight. When Henry extended his hand, I felt the entire room inhale as though my decision somehow held the power to absolve or condemn them, but all I felt was a quiet steadiness rising inside me, the kind that comes only after a line has been crossed too many times and finally refuses to disappear under excuses. I slipped my hand into his, and in that small motion, I sensed a shift in him too, relief, certainty, and a tenderness that contradicted the silent authority pulsing around him.
As the car carried us away, I let my hand rest on Henry's, and for the first time since the ceremony began, I felt a sense of calm blooming inside me. Not the fragile peace of pretending everything was fine, but the solid, anchored certainty that I was stepping into a life shaped not by mockery or expectation, but by truth, power, and a new version of myself I had only begun to understand. As the car slipped deeper into the night, the city lights streaking like melting gold across the windows, I felt my breath finally steady, the chaos of the evening softening into something clearer, something almost fragile inside me. It was strange how quickly a single moment, one cruel laugh, one quiet revelation, one display of unexpected power could unravel everything I thought I understood about my life. Henry sat beside me, relaxed now, his posture no longer carrying the sharp authority he had worn in the hall. Instead, he looked like the man who cooked with me on Sunday mornings, who listened more than he spoke, who cared not about how the world saw him, but about how I felt standing next to him. And yet, knowing what I knew now, I couldn't help replaying the image of his men entering the room with such precision, such unquestioned loyalty, such silent force. The realization that this strength belonged to him, not borrowed, not performed, but intrinsic, lit something inside me that was equal parts awe and disbelief. I turned my face toward the dark window, watching the reflections blur, and for the first time since leaving the reception hall, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. My son mocking my husband, my family laughing at a man they didn't know, the humiliation curdling in my chest as their voices rose in the very space meant to celebrate my new beginning. I thought I would cry, or crumble, or ache in a way that left me small, but instead, I felt an unexpected steadiness rising, something quiet, yes, but firm, rooted, unshakable. When Henry reached for my hand again, I didn't hesitate. The man whose hand I had held as we walked out of that hall, the man they had mocked with such careless arrogance. As we approached the crest of the hill, the full view opened before us. A sprawling estate, illuminated softly by ground lights that traced its edges. The building stretching wide with tall glass walls that reflected the night sky like calm water. It wasn't loud wealth, not gaudy or overly ornate, but a quiet, commanding elegance that spoke of intention, legacy, and a sense of power so deeply woven into its foundations, it didn't require announcement. My breath caught as the car slowed, the vast entrance casting long shadows across the stone steps, and for a moment I felt small, not diminished, but humbled by the sheer gravity of what Henry had entrusted me with tonight. When the car stopped and the driver opened the door, Henry stepped out first, then extended his hand to help me, his expression soft in a way that felt like a private gesture meant only for me. And as my feet touched the ground of this place that would now be part of my life, I felt a quiet shift inside myself, a recognition that I was crossing another threshold, not just into his world, but into the truth of who I was becoming beside him, shaped not by the mockery I left behind, but by the strength and clarity I had found on the way here. Standing at the threshold of Henry's estate, with the cool night air brushing against my skin and the quiet glow of the lights reflecting across the glass walls,
I felt the enormity of the evening settle into me, not as chaos anymore, but as a strange, undeniable clarity. Everything that had shattered at the wedding, every cruel laugh, every exposed truth, had led me to this stillness, this moment suspended between the life I had known and the one unfolding in front of me. Henry guided me up the steps with a gentleness that made my chest ache, and when he opened the tall doors, the soft warmth inside spilled out like a welcome meant for a long-awaited guest. The interior was breathtaking in its restraint. Clean lines, soft lighting, art that whispered rather than shouted, and a silence so peaceful it felt like a refuge carved out of the world. He paused just inside, watching me take it in, his expression carrying that subtle vulnerability he rarely let anyone see, and it struck me then how easily he could have used his wealth to shield himself, to distance himself. Yet instead, he had chosen to stand quietly beside me as my family mocked him, revealing only what was necessary and only when the truth demanded to be seen. I turned toward him, feeling something steady and certain take shape inside my chest, and I told him, softly but clearly, that I understood now why he lived quietly, why he hid this part of himself, why tonight's ugliness had been both painful and necessary. He didn't respond right away, just stepped closer and brushed his thumb lightly against my hand, his touch warm and careful, as though the entire night had exhausted him in ways he would never admit. He whispered that he had wanted to give me a simple life with simple joys, because he believed I deserved peace above anything else, but that he would never hide from me again, not his world, not his power, not the truth of what it meant to stand beside him. His honesty wrapped around my heart with a gentleness far deeper than any extravagance in the room, and in that moment, I realized that the life ahead of me wouldn't be defined by the wealth around us, nor by the small-minded mockery we had left behind, but by the quiet strength of the man who had chosen me without hesitation. I stepped closer until I could rest my forehead lightly against his chest, feeling his breath steady, feeling my own steady with it, and in that soft, still space between us, a sense of finality settled in, not a closing, but a beginning. Whatever waited beyond tonight, whatever truths and challenges his world held, I knew I would face them with him, not because of what he owned, not because of the power that shadowed his presence, but because in the midst of humiliation, revelation, and upheaval, he had remained exactly who he had always been with me, a man who chose love with intention, who protected it fiercely, and who now, quietly and completely, invited me to share the rest of his life without fear, without doubt, and without pretending to be anything less than extraordinary together. It had become a lineage of strength, quiet, unshakable, and multiplying. And what did you think of that twist? Let me know in the comments below. No, not a hint. He lived simply, quietly. I thought that was his entire world. Turns out it was only the surface. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, subscribe for more stories of justice, and share this video with a friend. Until next time, stay strong.